The air in the federal congressional hearing room felt charged, as if a sudden lightning strike might split the silence in two. Judge Samuel Alito sat at the witness table, his black robes cascading behind him like a shadow he carried everywhere. A faint, knowing smirk curled on his weathered face. Moments earlier, he had waved away Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's pointed question on judicial ethics with the lazy arrogance of a man brushing off an insect. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone dipped in condescension. "Perhaps you should focus on matters you actually understand." The words landed with the quiet violence of a gavel strike. The room froze. Liberal lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats. Conservative members leaned back with smug satisfaction, some exchanging glances that said, "He put her in her place." But the story of this day was not going to be written in smirks. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly from her seat. The crisp burgundy blazer she wore seemed to sharpen the lines of her posture. Her natural hair was pulled into an elegant twist, but it was her eyes, dark, steady, unblinking, that drew the room's attention. The tremor in her voice, if it had been there moments before, was gone. What replaced it was steel. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying with a calm authority that made even the court reporters pause mid-keystroke. "I think it's time we talk about what I actually understand." It was no longer a hearing. It was a face-off. For Alito, 74 years old, nearly 2 decades on the Supreme Court, this was familiar territory. He had navigated countless high-stakes hearings, parried political attacks, and maintained an unassailable image. For Crockett, 43, a first-term congresswoman, but a seasoned fighter in Dallas courtrooms, this was something else. This was an opening, and every instinct in her told her she wasn't going to let it slip. The atmosphere in the room shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. A faint crease appeared between Alito's brows. He sensed, perhaps too late, that this would not be the scripted exchange he had envisioned. In the gallery, the murmurs faded. Even the rustle of paper stopped. To understand the collision that was unfolding, you had to know who these two people really were. Alito represented the entrenched old guard, Princeton and Yale credentials, decades of shaping landmark rulings from the nation's highest bench. But the years had not been without controversy. Reports of undisclosed luxury trips with billionaire patrons, questions about his wife's political involvement, a growing perception that he had drifted into the comfortable belief that oversight was for other people. Crockett represented something very different, the rising wave of American politics that refused to bow. Born in St. Louis, she had grown up in a community battered by systemic neglect and a justice system that too often failed those without wealth or influence. No family, name to open doors. She earned her business degree from the University of Missouri, then went to Howard University School of Law with one goal: to defend those the system wanted to forget. As a public defender and civil rights attorney in Dallas, she had taken the cases no one else wanted: police brutality, voter suppression, discrimination by powerful institutions. She didn't just argue the law, she made juries feel the stakes in their bones. In 2022, she carried that grit into Congress, her platform crystal clear: judicial accountability, voting rights protection, and criminal justice reform. Today's hearing was the perfect storm. For months, investigative reports had painted a troubling picture of Supreme Court justices, Alito among them, accepting lavish trips and cutting real estate deals with the ultra-wealthy. The court's ethics code, voluntary and unenforceable, felt like a hollow promise to an increasingly skeptical public. Inside the hearing room, the battle lines were obvious. Democratic members came armed with meticulously tabbed research binders. Republicans had questions designed to shield, not probe. Young staffers in the gallery leaned forward as Crockett prepared her next move. The first round of questioning had been routine. Alito's answers, carefully worded and lawyerly, managed to acknowledge the questions without ever touching their core. He wielded legal nuance like a shield. Republican members took their turns tossing softballs. "Judge Alito," one congressman began smoothly, "can you help us understand the difference between personal friendship and inappropriate relationships with donors?" Alito's lips curved again in that same faint smirk. "Certainly, Congressman," he said, his voice as steady as ever, though for the first time that afternoon, it carried the faintest edge of caution. Smoothly, Alito replied, "The key, Congresswoman, is whether there's any quid pro quo. In my case, these were simply long-standing friendships with no bearing on pending cases." It was the kind of answer that sounded polished to the casual ear, measured, plausible, yet it slipped through the cracks of accountability like water through clenched fingers. Democratic members pressed harder, their voices gaining a sharper edge, but Alito had perfected the art of running out the clock. His long, deliberate responses carried the illusion of substance while revealing nothing. Across the dais, Republicans countered with accusations of political intimidation, while Democrats fired back with charges of enabling corruption. The exchanges grew hotter, but Alito stayed largely composed, his irritation surfacing only when a question cut too close. He had come prepared for this, armed with careful phrasing and the kind of institutional confidence that comes from decades of untouchable authority. Then, it was Jasmine Crockett's turn. "Judge Alito," she began, her voice low but precise, "I want to ask about something specific. Last year, you took a luxury fishing trip to Alaska with a billionaire who has had cases before the court. You never disclosed this trip. Can you explain how that meets any reasonable definition of ethical behavior?" Alito's answer was instantaneous and dismissive. "Congresswoman, I'm not sure you fully understand how judicial ethics actually work. These disclosure requirements are complex." "Actually, Your Honor," Crockett interrupted softly, her tone almost polite, but carrying the weight of a blade being unsheathed. "I understand perfectly well. I've practiced law for 15 years. What I don't understand is how a Supreme Court justice thinks he's above the basic ethical standards that bind every other federal judge in this country." A subtle shift passed over Alito's face, the first hairline fracture in his composure. His eyes narrowed. His voice took on the clipped cadence of a man moving into lecture mode. "Perhaps, Congresswoman, you should focus on making laws rather than telling judges how to interpret them. The separation of powers exists for a reason." Crockett didn't so much as blink. She reached into a thick folder and produced a document. "Judge Alito, I have here an ethics opinion you authored while on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. You wrote, and I quote, 'Even the appearance of impropriety can undermine public confidence in the judiciary. Judges must avoid any situation that might reasonably call their impartiality into question.' Do you remember writing that?" Alito shifted in his seat. "Congresswoman, context matters." "The context," Crockett said, her voice gaining force, "is that you held yourself to a higher standard 20 years ago than you do today. The context is that you've taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in undisclosed gifts from people with business before your court. The context is that you believe the rules apply to everyone but you." The room stilled. The ambient rustle of paper and hum of quiet conversations died. Staffers lowered their phones. Alito's tone sharpened. "I reject the premise of your question. I have followed all applicable ethics guidelines. Have you?" "Yes," Crockett shot back, not missing a beat. "And according to federal ethics experts, you've violated disclosure requirements multiple times. According to watchdog organizations, you've created conflicts of interest that would disqualify any lower court judge in this country. And according to plain common sense, You've accepted gifts that reek of the appearance of corruption. And then, Alito made his fatal error. Rather than holding his defensive ground, he lunged. His voice carried a slow, deliberate condescension, the kind that sinks into a room like poison. "Congresswoman," he said, the smirk curling back into place. "I've been a judge longer than you've been a lawyer. I was serving on the Supreme Court while you were still in law school. Perhaps you should focus on issues you actually understand, instead of grandstanding for the cameras." The insult landed like a slap. The smirk made it clear he believed he'd reclaimed control. Republican members nodded with approval. Conservative observers smiled. But Alito had misread the moment, and his opponent entirely. The reaction was immediate and electric. Democratic members straightened in their seats, some visibly bristling at the dismissal. In the gallery, young staffers and civil rights advocates exchanged looks of recognition. They'd just seen, in real time, the very arrogance that fueled their fight for reform. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She didn't even lean forward. She sat perfectly still, letting the silence stretch, her expression unreadable except for the unmistakable glint of calculation in her eyes. The cameras caught it, the look of a lawyer who had just heard a witness make the mistake she'd been waiting for and was already planning how to dismantle him. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but now it carried a razor's edge. "Your Honor," she said, stressing the title like a challenge, "I think it's time we talked about what I actually understand." And in that instant, everyone in the room felt the shift. The smirk on Alito's face began to falter. The Republicans' expressions tightened. The gallery leaned forward. Jasmine Crockett was about to dismantle one of the most powerful men in American law, piece by piece, and show the country exactly what she understood about power, accountability, and justice. Alito had awakened something in her, a force he was entirely unprepared to face. "What I understand, Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice cutting clean through the charged air, "is that I've spent 15 years in courtrooms across Texas, fighting for people who didn't have power, didn't have influence, people the system would have crushed if someone hadn't stood up for them." She let her words breathe before continuing, her gaze locked on him. "What I understand is that I've won civil rights cases against police departments, school boards, and corporations that believed they were beyond reach. And what I understand is that I have never, not once, had to explain to a client why I was taking luxury vacations with the opposing party." A ripple passed through the room. Crockett let the silence do its work before delivering the next blow. "What I understand," she went on, "is that when I was a public defender, making $45,000 a year, I turned down a $500 gift card from a grateful client, because even that could create a conflict of interest. What I understand is that the ethical lawyers I worked alongside wouldn't even accept lunch from someone who might appear in their courtroom." Alito tried to interject. "Congresswoman, these situations are not—" "You're absolutely right, Your Honor," she cut in, her voice firm but calm. "They're not comparable, because when I broke an ethics rule, I would have been disbarred. When you do it, you give speeches about why the rules don't apply to you." She reached into her folder and withdrew a stack of documents with the precision of someone laying evidence before a jury. "Let's talk about your record, Judge Alito. In 2008, you purchased stock in a company just 3 months before hearing a case involving that very company. You've participated in cases where you held stock, at least 3 that we know of. You took a luxury fishing trip to Alaska worth over $100,000 with a billionaire whose foundation had cases before your court. You flew private, stayed in luxury lodges, and disclosed none of it." Alito's face flushed. "Those are gross mischaracterizations." Crockett's voice didn't waver. "I understand that your wife flew flags associated with the January 6th insurrection, one of them upside down, while you were ruling on cases tied to that very event. The tension in the room thickened. Republican committee members shifted uneasily. Democrats leaned in. She wasn't finished. "You want to know what else I understand, Your Honor?" Her voice softened, but the weight of it landed heavier. "I understand what it's like to grow up in a community that doesn't trust the justice system, because they've seen too many examples of one set of rules for the powerful and another for everyone else." Her words slowed now, every syllable deliberate. "I understand what it's like to stand in front of a client and tell them that justice is supposed to be blind, while knowing the people making the ultimate decisions live by rules they rewrite for themselves. I understand what it's like to tell kids in my district that if they work hard and follow the rules, they can achieve anything in America, while watching Supreme Court justices accept gifts that would get any other public servant fired." She stepped closer to the witness table, the space between them shrinking to something intimate and dangerous. "You mentioned I should focus on issues I understand. So let's talk about judicial ethics law. Canon 2 says a judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. Canon 4 requires disclosure of financial interests. Canon 5 prohibits political activity." She held up another document. "According to legal ethics experts, whose field I understand because I have lived by it, you've violated every one of these canons multiple times." Alito's tone hardened. "These are politically motivated attacks." Crockett's eyebrows lifted. "Politically motivated? With all due respect, Your Honor, accountability isn't political. Ethics isn't political. Playing by the same rules as everyone else isn't political." Something was happening in the gallery now. The polite attention had transformed into something almost electric. Staffers sat straighter. Civil rights advocates nodded. Even reporters looked up from their laptops. Crockett sensed it. She pressed forward. "You want to know what I really understand, Judge Alito? I understand you've treated this entire hearing as though oversight is beneath you, as though accountability is beneath you, as though the American people's right to trust their judiciary is beneath you." Her voice rose, not in volume, but in power, each word sharpened to a point. "I understand you think your position makes you untouchable, but what you don't seem to understand is that in America," Crockett said, her voice carrying the weight of a verdict, no one is above the law." That was the blow that would ripple far beyond the walls of the hearing room, a line destined to loop on news programs, dominate social media feeds, and be quoted in law school classrooms for years to come. "Judge Alito, you've spent decades on the bench," she continued, every syllable deliberate, "and somewhere along the way, you seem to have forgotten the simplest truth of our justice system: equal justice under law. Not for some, not for the well-connected. For all." She didn't look away. "You sit on the highest court in this country, making decisions that touch the lives of every American. You wield more power than almost anyone in government. And yet, you act as though that power excuses you from the same ethical rules that bind every other public servant in America." The silence was total now. Even Alito seemed taken aback by the directness of the assault. "But here's what I understand that you clearly do not," she pressed. "Power without accountability is not justice, it's tyranny. And the American people, the people I represent, the people you serve, deserve better." Alito tried to rally, but the steadiness was gone. "Congresswoman, these attacks on judicial independence, this isn't an attack on independence," Crockett cut in, her voice swift and sharp. "This is a defense of integrity. Independence means freedom from political pressure in your decisions. It does not mean you are free to take lavish gifts from those with business before your court. It does not mean you get to live outside the rules." "I have never taken bribes," Alito snapped, the last of his composure cracking. "Then what?" Crockett asked evenly. "Do you call accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts from people whose fortunes depend on your rulings?" That was the breaking point. In the gallery, a young civil rights attorney who had driven from Baltimore rose to his feet and began clapping. The sound was quickly joined by others, first scattered, then swelling into sustained applause. Congressional staffers, legal observers, even a few journalists couldn't stop themselves. Democratic members grinned openly. Some joined in. Republican members sat stiff, caught between outrage and disbelief at the breach of protocol. Crockett didn't acknowledge the ovation. Her eyes stayed locked on Alito, but she could feel it behind her, a tide she had unleashed. She had just said what millions of Americans had been thinking, but had never heard spoken with such precision, in such a setting, to such a powerful man's face. It took nearly a minute for the chairman to restore order. When the clapping died, Alito looked different, smaller somehow, stripped of the imperviousness he had walked in with. Crockett leaned in. "Judge Alito, I have one last question. When you go home tonight, will you think about the young lawyers watching this hearing? Lawyers who are fighting to build ethical practices while following rules you seem to think don't apply to you? Will you think about the Americans who have lost faith in our courts because they see one standard for the powerful and another for everyone else? Or will you spend your time figuring out how to attack the messenger instead of confronting the message?" Alito stayed silent for several beats, his jaw tight. "I believe I have served the court and the country with integrity," he said finally, the words low and defensive. "Then prove it," Crockett replied. "Follow the same ethics rules as every other federal judge. Disclose your gifts. Recuse yourself when you have conflicts. Show the American people that justice really is equal under law." The room was utterly still. Alito had no answer. The most powerful judge in the nation had just been schooled, on the record, by a first-term congresswoman, and everyone knew it. As Crockett sat down, the hearing seemed to exhale. The buzz in the air was electric. Seasoned congressional reporters glanced at each other with looks that said, "This will be remembered." Staffers exchanged text messages under the table. Even the court reporters had an extra spark in their eyes. Within minutes, the internet caught fire. Clips of the exchange flooded every major platform. The hashtag #, Crockett versus Alito, trended nationally inside half an hour. One video racked up 100,000 views in the first 60 minutes. Progressive activists shared it with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like," and, "Finally, someone said it." Conservative commentators called it disrespectful grandstanding, but even some on the right admitted privately. Crockett had been devastatingly prepared. Young lawyers across the country reposted the clip with notes about how it had reignited their belief in why they entered the profession at all. In the hearing room, and far beyond it, the message landed. Power, no matter how high, is not immune from the truth. America has always prided itself on one promise. No one is above the law. And it was in that moment that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett delivered the line that would ricochet across social media, play on endless loops in news segments, and etch itself into political memory. "Judge Alito," she began, her voice steady but charged. "You've spent decades on the bench, yet somewhere along the way, you seem to have forgotten the simplest cornerstone of our justice system: equal justice under law. Not equal justice for some, justice for all." She didn't rush. She let the words settle, let them hang in the hushed air of the hearing room. Then she looked him dead in the eye. "You sit on the highest court in the land, making decisions that ripple through every American's life. You hold more power than almost anyone in our government. And you seem to believe that power shields you from the same ethical standards every other public servant must follow. The silence was absolute. Even Alito's famously unflappable expression faltered. "But here's the truth you don't seem to grasp," Crockett continued. "Power without accountability isn't justice. It's tyranny. And the American people, the people I represent, the people you serve, deserve better." When Alito finally spoke, his voice carried a faint edge of defensiveness. "Congresswoman, these attacks on judicial independence, this isn't an attack on judicial independence," she cut in before he could finish. "It's a defense of judicial integrity. Independence means making legal decisions free from political pressure. It doesn't mean immunity from consequences. And it certainly doesn't mean taking bribes." "I have never taken bribes," Alito snapped, his composure cracking wide enough for everyone to see. "Then what would you call accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts from people with cases before your court?" she asked, calm as ever. The question landed like a gavel strike. From somewhere in the gallery, a young civil rights lawyer, who'd driven all the way from Baltimore just to watch, stood and began to clap. At first it was a lone sound, echoing awkwardly in the chamber. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the applause swelled. Staffers, legal observers, even some reporters who knew they were breaking decorum. The Democratic members grinned openly. Republican faces froze in uncertainty. Crockett stayed fixed on Alito, but she was aware of what was happening. She just put into words the simmering frustration millions had felt for years. She had stripped away the robes, revealing a man who acted as though the rules were for other people. The chairman's gavel banged for order, but it took nearly a full minute before the clapping faded. By then, Alito looked rattled, his morning confidence replaced by the wary eyes of someone caught under unforgiving light. "Judge Alito," Crockett said. Once calm returned, "I have one last question. Tonight, when you go home, will you think about the young lawyers who follow every rule while you dismiss the same standards? Will you think about Americans losing faith in our justice system because of double standards? Or will you focus on attacking the messengers instead of addressing the message?" Alito hesitated, the pause stretching so long it became its own kind of answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "I believe I have served the court and the country with integrity." "Then prove it," Crockett said softly, but with unmistakable steel. "Follow the same ethics rules as every other federal judge. Disclose your gifts. Recuse yourself when there's a conflict. Show the American people justice really is equal under law." There was no comeback, just silence. The most powerful judge in America had been publicly schooled by a first-term congresswoman, and everyone knew it. When she sat down, the air in the hearing room practically vibrated. Seasoned observers whispered to each other that they hadn't felt this kind of electricity in years. Reporters' thumbs flew over their phones. Even the court stenographers looked energized. Within minutes, social media erupted. The hashtag number sign Crockett vs. Alito began trending inside half an hour. A clip of her, "Power without accountability isn't justice, it's tyranny." Moment exploded online, hitting 100,000 views before the hour was out. Progressive activists labeled it the definition of accountability. Even some conservative voices begrudgingly admitted that Crockett had been devastatingly prepared. For young lawyers and law students, it was more than political theater. It was a blueprint for taking on entrenched power. Constitutional law professors dissected her performance for TV interviews, calling it a masterclass in confronting institutional arrogance. And in the days that followed, it became clear. This wasn't just a viral clip. It was the spark for something much bigger. The exchange between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Judge Alito had barely concluded before it began ricocheting through every corner of the internet. Within hours, millions had watched the moment when a young, determined legislator refused to be diminished by the smug authority of one of the nation's most powerful judges. What began as a tense hearing had transformed into a cultural lightning strike. Clips flooded timelines, the most shared sequence capturing Alito's dismissive, "Perhaps you should focus on issues you actually understand," and Crockett's unflinching retort, "Power without accountability isn't justice. It's tyranny." The camera caught it all, Alito's smirk faltering into unease, Crockett's posture straightening as her confidence surged. It wasn't just a political clash, it was a visual dismantling of condescension in real time. Law students dissected the moment in late-night study sessions. Newsrooms scrambled to book Crockett for interviews, while her congressional office overflowed with calls of support. Across the legal community, the scene became an instant case study. Professor Sarah Martinez of Georgetown Law praised how Crockett distilled complex legal ethics into language anyone could grasp. It was more than political theater, constitutional scholar Dr. James Wilson noted. It was a master class in dismantling institutional arrogance with nothing more than facts and preparation. Even commentators on the opposite side of the political aisle admitted her execution was flawless. "You may not like her politics," one conservative blogger conceded, "but you can't ignore her command of the material and her poise under fire." The impact was immediate. Democratic leaders seized on the momentum, showcasing Crockett at rallies and talk shows. Progressive organizations framed the clip as the rallying cry for judicial ethics reform, funneling new energy into legislative pushes for transparency and accountability. Republican strategists were left cornered. Defending Alito's tone risked looking elitist. Attacking Crockett's questions risked looking hostile to oversight. The safest play was to change the subject, but the internet made that impossible. Beneath the surface, something deeper had shifted. For decades, Supreme Court justices had operated under a shroud of deference so thick it smothered scrutiny. The court's public trust had already been eroding, yet no one had cracked the code for challenging its authority effectively, until now. Crockett's strategy fused legal precision with moral urgency, creating a template for confronting entrenched power in the age of viral media. The moment galvanized reform advocates, who quickly wove her performance into their campaigns. Polling in the weeks after the hearing revealed a notable jump in public support for stricter judicial ethics, especially among younger Americans, who saw in Crockett a reflection of their own frustration and aspirations. The image of a young, diverse congresswoman holding an older, powerful judge to account became a symbolic inversion of the old political order. For Crockett, the transformation was immediate and profound. She was no longer just a freshman legislator. She was a national figure. Invitations from universities, civic groups, and legal forums poured in. Small-dollar donations surged. But beyond the political gains, she had offered proof to every young leader who had been talked over, underestimated, or patronized, that institutional arrogance could be dismantled with enough preparation, clarity, and courage. Judge Alito, in contrast, withdrew into near silence. His rare public statements after the hearing were noticeably more cautious, as though he had begun to feel the weight of a public gaze that had once barely brushed the Supreme Court. Legal observers speculated whether this was the beginning of a cultural recalibration for the judiciary. The larger lesson was undeniable. Preparation beats posturing. Accountability doesn't require disrespect, and Americans are hungry for leaders who won't let power go unanswered. Months later, the clip still circulated. In classrooms, advocacy, trainings, and kitchen table conversations. The phrase, "power without accountability isn't justice, it's tyranny," found its way onto posters, t-shirts, and bumper stickers, evolving from a sharp rebuttal into a rallying cry for reform across the political spectrum. In the end, The confrontation became more than a viral moment. It became a parable about democracy's lifeblood. The courage to question, to demand answers, to refuse to let tradition shield misconduct. Crockett's performance was proof that in a nation built on checks and balances, no branch, no bench, no individual is beyond scrutiny. She didn't just speak truth to power. She reminded America that true power belongs to the